Okay, so moving on, there's just a few other things I want to cover with surveys. Um, there is a couple questions in the exam on surveys, but it's not a major focus. Surveys and also reliability, like we'll talk about, are kind of a whole other topic. I know there is a third year course you can take on measurement, so if this is interesting to you, feel free to take that. But we're not going to go into too much because we've already got a lot we've covered and still have to cover. So, um, okay. So beyond open-ended versus closed questions, an important when you are writing most surveys and you have people respond with something, you also need to consider how many points you're going to have if it's some sort of scale. So a lot of times when we ask people something like um, rate your physical health, an important question is, of course, how many alternatives can they select from? Right? So for example, or rather the previous example, we asked them just either very good, somewhat good, not good at all, which you can probably imagine is pretty restricted. Um, with only three options, it's kind of hard to tell. What about the people that line somewhere between very good and somewhat good, or the people that line somewhere between somewhat good and not good at all? Well, we wouldn't really capture that because our scale is very narrow. So there's not really as far as I'm aware, um, well, 7 or 5 or so is usually a good number. Somewhere in that range, like single digits. Usually, you don't ask people like, "How's your health?" from 0 to 100. Usually, like less than 10 is a good number. But it all again just depends on what uh, what you're asking about. Maybe there might be situations where it does make sense to have more of a range. But with something like physical health, um, it makes sense to ask maybe somewhere between 1 and 7. That's a good enough range. You're gonna have very poor, somewhat poor, a little bit poor, medium, you know, pretty good, quite good, very good, something like that. So you get a good range of responses, and it's a little more sensitive to people who are not very poor or very good, or right in the middle, these intermediate options. Again, compared to this one where it's not very flexible, it's only three options. One other thing to consider when picking a scale is whether you want an even or an odd number. So if you have an odd number, what happens is they can always pick neutral, or they can pick the middle number rather. So if you're asking like something about, do you approve of this policy? And maybe you're expecting some people not to have an opinion on that. Well, providing an odd numbered scale means that they can always pick the middle one, meaning they neither agree nor disagree, right? On the other hand, with even number, so imagine it was just 2 to 7, that wouldn't make too much sense. It forces them to pick one side or the other. So they don't have to pick 7 or 2, but they have to pick either 5 or 4. So they can't just sit in the middle. So again, it all just depends on what your research question is. If you have something where you want people to make a decision, then maybe an even numbered scale would be ideal. But if you want to allow them the option to just pick neutral or no opinion, then an odd number is going to be good because they can pick that. But anyways, obviously, so when we choose a different scale, say a 1 3 option scale versus a 7 rating, um, it's of course going to give us different data. So um, we might split it up more categorically and see, okay, this many people say very good, this many people say somewhat good, and this many people say not good at all. Whereas with the 7 scale, we'll probably take the mean, right? Because we're gonna want to know what's the average selection. Again, all depending on your research goals. Right? So here's another example that again, this is the same. This is the same one though, so it helps by the way to label all of them. So I can kind of make it a little bit more reliable. So I can say one means very poor, two means moderately poor, three means somewhat poor, so on and so forth. Again, this is going to be a lot more sensitive than something like this with only three options. Okay. This is usually referred to as a Likert scale, meaning that, or rather, sorry, let me clarify that. So a rating scale is just any time you have them give a rating, obviously, but when you specifically ask them indicate the degree of agreement or disagreement to a statement, that's known as a Likert scale. So the same question as a Likert scale would just be my physical health is good for my age. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. You just give them a statement, and then they can either agree or disagree with it, or anything in the middle. Okay. So we're not really going to talk about administering them. That's not on the final exam. But one thing I do want to talk about pretty briefly is just the issue of reliability. So when we design a survey, it's very important that we consider that the questions are actually consistent with one another if they're meant to be. So if you think about it, if you're assessing something like, say, anxiety, and all your questions from the same for the same participant should be somewhat similar, at least close to each other. So if you're asking them about anxiety, you ask them one question about anxiety, and they give like a 0 rating, so they don't agree with it at all. But then on others, they're giving the highest ranking in terms of agreement. Well, that suggests that your scale is not very reliable, because what's happening is that different questions meant to assess the same thing are giving different results. So in other words, they're not really reliable. They're not consistent with one another. Okay. So there's a few of these, and again, we're not going to really go into this too much. But the big one here is just internal consistency. And what you're going to do here is you're going to look at correlation between different items, or at least different items meant to assess the same thing, and see that they correlate with each other. So if there were, say, 3 different questions about anxiety, those 3 scores should be similar to each other from the same participant, right? If they're different, well, then there's an issue of reliability. Well, a couple others you can use. You can use test, retest, parallel form, split half, but we're not going to go into those. But just kind of keep that in mind, that multiple questions that are meant to assess the same thing should be getting similar responses. If they're not, then there's a problem. And again, we measure that by reliability stat known as Cronbach's. That's a correlation between different things assessing the same, different questions assessing the same thing. And just one more thing on this note, we don't really use single questions, or at least not very often. Well, actually, that's not true. It, again, always depends on the research question. But for most assessment tools, like say measuring anxiety or measuring depression, it's usually not going to be just one question about that, because it's kind of the same issue as with number of participants. When you get a very small sample, it's going to be less reliable. But when you have more questions, it's a little bit more reliable. You can get the average multiple assessments. There's a limit on that, though. It's not usual. You don't. More questions is only better up to a point, and you don't want to be overly redundant, or make your survey too long that it's not really useful at all. I think that's all we're going to cover for surveys. So, and there's another video I'm also going to post that is a good review of things to think about when wording questions and stuff like that. Okay.